Welcome to Pioneers in Healthcare. I'm Dr. Len Saputo. I'm board certified in internal medicine and have practiced for nearly 40 years here in the Diablo Valley. This show is about people who are special people who have made contributions to medicine that are unusual and outstanding. And today we have a special guest. His name is Dr. David Rasnick. He has a PhD in chemistry from Georgia Institute of Technology. He has 20 years of experience in the pharmaceutical biotech industry. He has studied HIV/AIDS since 1980, and he's the former president of Rethinking AIDS and the former president of the International Coalition for Medical Justice. He's a member of the Presidential AIDS Advisory Panel of South Africa, and he's worked closely with Peter Duesberg from UC Berkeley on the aneuploidy theory of cancer, which we'll do on another day. He's also was a senior researcher with Dr. Matthias Rath at the Health Foundation in Africa. He has a book out that's called Germ of Lies, which you can find on lulu.com. David, it's wonderful to have you here. It's such a privilege to be working with you today.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
We have kind of a long and interesting history because you're a researcher. You've been involved in the pit, okay, where the information comes out that tells the clinicians, the doctors, what's a fact and what's not a fact. And things have gotten all bungled up. And here we are now with a lot of different ideas about what HIV and AIDS mean, and maybe that's a good place to start. You know, people kind of make the assumption of HIV and AIDS, and there's a lot of controversy about whether or not that's true. What is HIV?
HIV is a retrovirus. It's one of at least 3,000 or 4,000 that have been cataloged, and it would be the first retrovirus to cause disease if it were true that it caused any disease at all.
So there's never been a retrovirus that's been known to cause a single disease in the history of medicine.
That's true. And HIV, I'm among many other scientists around the world, probably several thousand, that have concluded, based on the evidence, that HIV is completely harmless and it certainly does not cause AIDS or anything else.
So you're saying it's much like a PSA might be in prostate cancer, where the PSA goes up, but there's no point treating the PSA because the problem is it's a cancer someplace.
It's worse than that.
Okay.
It's totally worse than that. HIV has never been obtained from a human being. People should understand that. Retrovirus...
Never been cultured from a human being.
Never been obtained from a human being.
What does that mean?
For example, like if you have hepatitis or flu or a cold or measles or chickenpox, any viral disease, you can take a sample of blood, or at least from the wound or the pox.
You can culture it.
Don't even have to culture it. There's a virus there that you can quantify without even culturing. You can culture, but typically you can spin it in a centrifuge and get a little bit of it in a vial, and you can quantify it. It will be infectious, viable virus that you got directly from the patient. If you put it into another human being, that will infect the other human being. That has never been done with HIV.
That's just really hard to believe. I mean, that's some of Koch's postulates. I mean, that's who's the guy who was the infectious disease, father of infectious diseases,
yeah,
who says you have to do that to prove that actually a disease is caused by a particular organism.
Well, HIV led the bandwagon where you can basically invent something out of thin air and turn it into a multi-billion-dollar, hundreds of billion-dollar industry. Another example would be the hepatitis C, which is even acknowledged by Chiron, which used to exist, the company that made the original hepatitis C test, that they never ever actually obtained hepatitis C. They just got bits and pieces of it and then inferred what this virus must be. And people to this day are being tested for something that has never ever been obtained from a human being.
Now, is there an association between people who are HIV positive and tend to get AIDS?
Yes, it's an association by definition.
Okay.
In fact, you cannot get AIDS by definition unless you have antibodies to HIV.
So you can find the antibodies to the HIV virus. Does that mean that the virus is there if you can make an antibody against it?
No, it does not. In fact, the presence of the antibody, that's the principle of immunization. It means that your immune system is won out and it's defeated the pathogen, the virus, and it's gone. That's, for example, if you've ever had measles or the chickenpox. You'll have antibodies to it, but the virus is not detectable.
So when somebody has something like mumps or measles or chickenpox, and they have antibodies, the illness is done.
Exactly.
They don't have the antibodies when they're sick. And that's exactly the situation you're saying about HIV and AIDS.
That's right. They generate it over time, and that's how they defeat the viral infection. But it's even worse than that. The inserts that come with the antibody test for HIV say explicitly in there that they have no reference standard to determine whether or not the antibodies that they detect positive in the test actually have anything to do with HIV. They don't even know if those antibodies are really from HIV because they have no reference standard.
Well, how did we ever get to a situation then? This is not making any sense. How could a logical physician or the whole medical profession come to the conclusions based on no evidence? Or that's probably a question you want to ask me. I don't know.
I mean, I've asked myself that too, because when I was a young scientist in my early 30s, back in 1980, when this whole AIDS thing popped up, I was eager to get on to it, work on it like every other scientist that I knew. It was such a bizarre thing. You know, it was all these weird diseases I'd never heard of in my life were occurring, popping up exclusively in gay men. I mean, that's strange. I thought it was my Andromeda strain, you know, at the time, and I wanted to work on it. But I learned years later that the Centers for Disease Control had actually accurately figured out what AIDS was as early as 1982. They had discovered that it was a drug disease, that the reason that these AIDS diseases, these immune deficiency diseases and other diseases, were the direct result of chronic use of recreational drugs, amphetamines, poppers, heroin, cocaine, and things like that.
Okay.
How that changed was by decree at a press conference on April 23rd.
By decree?
By decree.
There's a scientific approach. I, the king, now say it's this way, so therefore it is?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
I remember it very distinctly because, remember, I was a scientist eager to know. I'd spent about 4 years wondering how I could apply my talents as a scientist to work on AIDS. But nobody really understood in the scientific world what was causing AIDS. And then on April 23rd, 1984, Margaret Heckler, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, brought out Robert Gallo of the National Cancer Institute and said that he had discovered the probable cause of AIDS. The very next day, they deleted the word probable.
And Robert became a fact.
It became a fact. Robert Gallo applied for a patent on his HIV test that very day. The federal government got behind it. Now the federal government, we taxpayers, as of this year, because of the latest legislation for the PEPFAR program, which had just voted in another $48 billion for African AIDS, we have now spent $250 billion, $250 billion on AIDS. American taxpayers have, just not the drug companies, not volunteer organizations, but the federal government has spent this money.
Wow.
And they have not saved the first AIDS patient. They use that fact to advertise more money to do AIDS research and to warn people about safe sex and condoms and things.
Okay, now people are talking, and one of the things I know you know a lot about is the infectiousness of this disease.
Right. Supposedly.
Well, that's what everybody says. You turn on the television set and you start hearing people talking about AIDS, and what they're talking about is be sure you have a condom, make sure that you're...
Sexual transmission.
Yeah, it's an STD.
Right.
And what does the data actually show? Is it?
Well, the first thing the data is clear on, absolutely, totally clear, is that retroviruses, remember HIV is a retrovirus, are not sexually transmitted. Even if it caused AIDS, it is not sexually transmitted. Scientists have known this, well, I guess 50 years. You can fingerprint and mix a bunch of lab rats together, and this brand has a certain endogenous retroviruses.
Right.
This one does. You mix them together. They do not transmit them sexually to each other. You can take them out, and you can identify what strain of rat they are by their spectrum of retroviruses, because they don't get mixed.
My goodness.
And the same is true with human beings. No study has ever shown, even with HIV or SIV, the so-called simian immunodeficiency virus, no laboratory experiment has ever demonstrated sexual transmission of a retrovirus, including HIV or any of its laboratory equivalents.
Well, then where did the whole medical profession get the idea that this is an STD? I mean, you shouldn't have to answer that, but you probably know the answer.
Well, it took me a while, because you see, again, we have a quarter century now of this stuff. And I started out being as mainstream as you can get.
Yeah.
I made organic chemist by training, and I've worked in arthritis, emphysema, parasites, cancer, and then AIDS. And so I thought, well, all I need is the target. now we have a virus, and I know viruses have enzymes, and I try to make inhibitors for these enzymes. And then over the course of my being a scientist and being confronted with the contradictions of the results of the research data, you have to scratch your head and you say, wait a minute, retroviruses are not sexually transmissible. Nobody's ever obtained a viable sample, free infectious HIV from a human being. What's going on here? And it was clearly by certainly 1985, all up to 87 for sure, that AIDS itself was not a contagious disease. It stayed within the same risk groups. It was 8 out of 9 AIDS cases to this day are still male, and 60% are gay men.
So an infectious disease shouldn't be able to discriminate between one person and another, should it?
There's no virus that knows whether you're white or black, gay or straight, rich or poor, or what zip code you live in, except HIV, apparently.
Would you have any idea why the CDC is saying that this is an STD and that we should be careful? It's a sexually transmitted disease?
This is area for speculation because there's no documentation whatever. There's no study that shows that even AIDS itself is sexually transmitted. In fact, there's all of the studies that tried to quantify the efficiency of sexual transmission of HIV, by the way, have never succeeded in even coming up with an estimate that they could base it, that was based on scientific data. Zero. In fact, the largest controlled study, Nancy Padian, it was done, I think, in 1996, American Journal of Epidemiology, it was published in, showed it was a 10-year study. It was the largest of its kind. Not a single one of the there was these discordant couples. One was HIV positive, one was HIV negative. And many of them, probably most of them, I don't remember the exact numbers, did not use condoms or anything during the course of this study. Not a single HIV sexual partner, HIV negative sexual partner, became HIV positive during this. Nobody has ever demonstrated that an HIV negative person becomes HIV positive via sexual intercourse.
That's just shocking.
It is.
And yet the physicians, okay, I have to say that I feel very sorry for physicians. These are people trying to do the right thing. They're good people. They're clinicians. But they're not scientists. And they depend on the literature that's being published. And they also listen to the kinds of documents that come out of CDC and FDA about what's right and what's not right. How are we going to help those people to understand something in a different sort of way that gets the truth out there?
Well, money has killed the whole scientific process. I'm a scientist, and over my 30-some-odd years of being a professional scientist, I've watched it go from being one of the most democratic activities on this planet, far more democratic than any regular
and lots
political.
Of integrity. You
lots of integrity,
the right stuff.
Really good people. It didn't matter who you were. You know, it's what you did and your integrity that you brought to this. I've watched that evaporate over the years, and the place where it's fallen apart the worst is the United States. Unfortunately, Europe has resisted, but they're caving in now and becoming more and more like the American thing.
You know, before you go on with this, I want to just substantiate what Dr. Raznick is saying. He's saying that the literature that we have, the medical literature, the scientific literature, is no longer believable. And it's not just him saying it. Marcia Angel, who was a physician and chief editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, Catherine DeAngelis of the Journal of the American Medical Association, Ushma Anil of another major medical journal, have all quit their jobs and said they are disappointed, disillusioned, and can't believe the low quality of material that's coming across their desk that's published in their journals. And it's because of other factors. There are people who have an axe to grind, who have a mission to accomplish, who have an ulterior motive to be able to get their point across. So if a pharmaceutical company, for example, is doing a study, they're going to make it look the best they can. They're not going to invest $500 million, okay, in a study and come out and say, don't buy our drug, it sucks. So we're seeing a lot of it. So what you're saying is no more than a reflection of what they are saying, and you've personally experienced that.
Yeah, and more people are. It is such an obvious problem now that many of the mainstream people are speaking out.
Even the physicians are beginning to question.
Yeah,
and look at the direct-to-consumer ads and all the problems that come with that.
Right.
Big deal. But I want to take this back to this whole subject of AIDS now. We talked a little about HIV, the test, and some of the reasons why things are like they are. Tell us what AIDS is. I mean,
it stands for, the letters AIDS stand for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome.
Okay.
This acquired immune deficiency syndrome has been known long before what we call AIDS with the capital AIDS. It was principally in people who were malnourished or premature babies, for example. There was good examples of this after World War II when the Allies went in. They looked in Germany and they saw the consequences of malnutrition.
Sure.
And AIDS popped up among these